the violinist Eugène Ysaÿe. Eugène Ysaÿe has been described as one of the greatest violinists of all time, despite becoming famous relatively late in life for a violinist, around his late 20s, early 30s. In this video I'm going to draw on comments from Henry Roth, who has great insight on Ysaÿe, given that Roth's teacher was himself a pupil of Ysaÿe, so he had information handed down to him. We'll draw on other sources as well. The links will be in the description box. Ysaÿe was a Belgian virtuoso violinist, composer and conductor. He was regarded as the king of the violin, or as Nathan Milstein put it, the Tsar of the violin, and forms part of the so-called Franco-Belgian school of violin playing heritage. He could be called the bridge between the 19th and the 20th century of violin playing, and has been described as the foremost interpreter of the string works of the French and Belgian composers of his time. Ysaÿe was born in Liège, Belgium, and began violin lessons at age 5 with his father. His parents were Nicolas Ysaÿe and Marie-Thérèse Sautiot. They actually wed 2 years after Eugene's birth. Eugène Ysaÿe made steady rather than spectacular progress at first. He would later recognise his father's teaching as the foundation of everything he knew on his instrument, even though he went on to study with highly reputed masters. In 1867, Ysaÿe entered the Royal Conservatory of Liège to study with Désiré Heinberg, and in the process won a shared second prize with his performance of the Viotti 22nd Violin Concerto. He then went on in 1873 to study privately with Henryk Wieniawski, some say for 2 years. Roth says that it was for exactly 12 lessons in Brussels. He also studied with Henri Vieuxtemps in Paris, Lambert Massard and Rodolphe Massard. As well as having private lessons with Vieuxtemps, Vieuxtemps also became his sponsor. His first public appearance in a concert was when he was age 7. He was not what you could describe as a wunderkind. He was once apparently even asked to leave the conservatory at Liège on the pretext that he was never likely to become a violinist. After his graduation from the Royal Conservatory of Liège, Ysaÿe was the principal violin of the Benjamin Blees Beer Hall Orchestra, which later developed into the Berlin Philharmonic. And he became the concertmaster of Blees's orchestra. Many musicians of note and influence came regularly to hear this orchestra, and Ysaÿe in particular, among them Joseph Joachim, Franz Liszt, Clara Schumann, and Anton Rubinstein. The latter asked that Ysaÿe be released from his contract to accompany him on tour. And so he toured Norway, Russia and France, whilst in Norway allegedly under the management of Ole Bull's son in 1881. In 1883 he played a concert under Edouard Colonne at the Paris Conservatoire, performing Lalo's Symphonie Espagnole and Saint-Saëns' Introduction Rondo Capriccioso, both scintillating showpieces made indelible by Ysaÿe's interpretative zeal and beguiling phrasing. He became friends with composers such as César Franck, Chausson, d'Indy and Debussy, and made appearances in Russia in 1882. He would actually return some 14 times to Russia during his career. He played sonatas with Anton Rubinstein and Annette Esipova, the wife of Leschetizky. Real success though came aged 32 in Vienna. This is similar to Sarasate and Kreisler, who only became really famous relatively late in terms of a violinist. Slowly and painfully, Ysaÿe had worked his way up the ladder, so to speak. In 1894, he conducted the Ysaÿe concerts in Brussels, which featured notable soloists and new works by French and Belgian composers. He would collaborate with musicians such as Casals, Chrysler, Thibault, and Pugnal. At nearly 6 feet tall with broad shoulders, Ysaÿe had an imposing physical appearance. As a young man, he was, you could say, quite handsome, with clear blue eyes and well-combed thick black hair. But he started to tend towards obesity fairly early on. When Ysaÿe was 27 years old, he was recommended as a soloist for one of the concerts Cologne in Paris, which was the start of his great success as a concert artist. He met Joachim and Ferdinand Hiller when performing in 1879 in Cologne. From there he met Clara Schumann and Joachim Raff. Schumann performed the Beethoven C minor sonata with him. The next year Ysaÿe received a professorship at the Brussels Conservatoire. His teaching career continued for the rest of his life, even after he left the conservatory in 1898. During his tenure as professor of the Conservatoire, Ysaÿe continued to tour ever more widely, visiting all of Europe, Russia, and the United States. Despite health concerns, particularly regarding the condition of his hands, Ysaÿe was at his best when performing. In 1886, he established the Ysaÿe Quartet, which premiered Debussy's string quartet. As his physical ailments grew more prohibitive, Ysaÿe turned more to teaching, conducting, and an early love of his, composition. He'd been offered the post of music director of the New York Philharmonic in 1898, but declined it due to his busy solo performance schedule at the time. In 1918, however, he accepted the music director's position with the Cincinnati Symphony Orchestra, where he remained until 1922, and with which he made a number of recordings. In terms of Ysaÿe's playing style and playing quality, he is said to have possessed a large and flexible tone influenced by a considerable variety of vibrato, from no vibrato at all to very intense. Ysaÿe's playing was known for its virtuosity, expressiveness, and intensive use of vibrato. In his own words, he would do nothing which wouldn't have for goal emotion, poetry, and heart. Possibly the most distinctive feature of Ysaÿe's interpretations was his masterful rubato, similar to Chopin apparently, who had a good command of the rubato. Although Ysaÿe was a great interpreter of late Romantic and early modern composers, such as Max Bruch, Camille Saint-Saëns, César Franck, who said he was their greatest interpreter, he was admired for his Bach and Beethoven interpretations as well. His technique was brilliant and finely honed, and in this respect he's the first modern violinist whose technique was without the shortcomings of some earlier artists. Henry Roth, when comparing Ysaÿe with Heifetz, makes the following comment: Ysaÿe was as free as a bird on the wing, whereas Heifetz was punctiliously faithful to his own preset fingerings and bowings during each performance. He liked to use flautato bowing to make the violin sound like a flute. His vibrato was a direct reflection of his personality. A vibrato descended from Wieniawski. And apparently he held the bow with 3 fingers and thumb, completely excluding the 4th finger. Apparently Ysaÿe was a victim of stage fright. He began suffering from bouts of pre-concert nerves. At times he became literally paralysed with fear. The fingers of his left hand rendered virtually useless. The fingers are weak and the bow unsteady, he despaired in a letter of 1909. I'm going through one of those pessimistic crises, nerve-wracking and terribly sad. What of composers who have dedicated works to Ysaÿe? Well, Claude Debussy dedicated his only string quartet to the violinist, who studied the score with great care. This is the G minor string quartet, premiered in 1893 by Ysaÿe's quartet. Camille Saint-Saëns dedicated 2 pieces to Ysaÿe, his first string quartet and the double concerto La Muse et le Poète, opus 1, 3 and 2. And of course César Franck dedicated his violin sonata in A. This was actually written for Ysaÿe as a wedding present for him and his wife in 1886. He played it that same day of his wedding, and during the sonata's 1886 premiere, dusk began to fall, and with no artificial lighting in the museum where they were performing, Ysaÿe and his accompanist Léontine Baude-Pen played the remaining 3 movements from memory in the near darkness. I assume the premiere was a separate occasion to his actual wedding in order for him to have been able to memorise the piece. Then we have Ernest Chausson, who dedicated his poem, one of my favourite pieces of music for violin, to Ysaÿe in response to Ysaÿe's request for a concerto. Other composers inspired by Ysaÿe's artistry to write for included Fauré, who dedicated his first violin sonata to him, plus Max Bruch and Edvard Grieg. Here are some of Ysaÿe's notable students. One of Ysaÿe's most famous compositions is his 6 sonatas, and the dedicatees are as follows. Each one is dedicated to a younger virtuoso in the violin firmament, as though Ysaÿe intended them as a musical gift to the next generation. The first 4 were written for established virtuosos, Joseph Szigeti, Jacques Thibaud, George Enescu and Fritz Kreisler, while the final pair went to 2 highly gifted players on the verge of celebrity. Former pupil Mathieu Crickboom, the original second violin in Ysaÿe's own quartet, and Manuel Quiroga, whose career was cut tragically short in 1937 by a traffic accident in New York. Requiring a high level of virtuosity, these 6 solo violin sonatas later became Ysaÿe's best-known works. Ysaÿe was present at Vieuxtemps' funeral. The funeral procession of Vieuxtemps was held in Verviers, Belgium on August 28, 1881, and attracted European attention. Vieuxtemps' famous violin, the Vieuxtemps Guarneri d'Algésie, was carried on a pillow behind his hearse by his student, Eugène Ysaÿe. I think this is the d'Algésie that Eugène Ysaÿe later owned himself. What about Eugène Ysaÿe's family? Well, he was married twice. His first marriage on the 28th of September 1886 was in Arlon to Louise Bourdeau from Dendermonde, with whom he had 3 sons and 2 daughters, Gabriel, Carrie, Thérèse, Courtésy, Antoine and Théodore. César Franck presented his violin sonata in A to them as a gift on the morning of the wedding. And after a hurried rehearsal, Ysaÿe performed the piece at the marriage celebration. So here's the answer then. It had its formal concert premiere in Brussels on the 15th of December 1886 with Franck in the audience. After Louise's death on the 9th of February 1924, and in his 70th year, Ysaÿe married a pupil of his, Brooklyn-born Jeanette Dinkin. 36 years his junior, she was a violinist who in her teens had studied with prominent teachers such as Franz Kneissl, Leopold Auer and Ottokar Ševčík. Ysaÿe met her in 1922 while conductor of the Cincinnati Orchestra. She cared for him in his ailing years. Eugène's only request of her after she died was that she carry on her performances under his name. Ysaÿe's brother was pianist and composer Théo Ysaÿe, born in 1865 and died in 1918, and his great-grandson is apparently Marc Ysaÿe, founder controller of Radio Classic 21 and drummer of rock band Machiavel. His granddaughter Nadine Ysaÿe Mosbau was a noted concert pianist who toured Europe with José Iturbi before settling down in Canada. She also hosted and performed on a classical radio program on CKAR Radio in Huntsville, Ontario. Ysaÿe's great-grandson Frank Mosbaugh is a Canadian musician, singer and award-winning commercial jingle composer. And a small digression into the topic of the violin E string. It was during Ysaÿe's era that the gut E string, which so often broke during a concert, was replaced by the far more brilliant wire E strings. According to Henry Roth, whose own teacher was Ysaÿe's pupil, Ysaÿe favoured playing as many notes as possible in a passage on the E string. He enjoyed this new, brilliant wire E string sound. Some background to why Ysaÿe moved to America. His 3 sons were conscripted into the army during World War I, and Ysaÿe at this time sadly became plagued by bowing arm tremors and occasional memory lapses. By the time he fled Belgium for England and the US with his wife in 1914, he was considering a change of career to conducting. Yet he continued giving recitals both in London and in the US, where he became conductor of the Cincinnati Orchestra from 1918 to 1922. Decline and death. Ysaÿe took his final bow as a performer with a 1927 concert in Barcelona. Despite that, in 1924 his creative facility hit an entirely new level, with a set of 6 solo violin sonatas composed in homage to Johann Sebastian Bach, whose solo sonatas and partitas Ysaÿe had heard played matchlessly by Joseph Szigeti. His playing actually began to decline in his mid-50s after 1910. He did not possess the longevity in playing of Elman, who played into his 70s, or Milstein, who played into his 80s. Carl Flesch and others have blamed this on his not using the 4th little finger when holding the bow. However, Henry Roth states that it was more likely due to complications from his diabetes. By the time he was 60, he was basically finished as a player, and so had a relatively short playing career. He suffered from memory lapses in his later years. Despite years of concertizing and a sojourn in Cincinnati in the US, Ysaÿe lived most of his life in Belgium and was an ardent Belgian patriot. Roth states that he was a devotee of wine, women and song. His appetite for food and drink was enormous, and diabetes and phlebitis eventually culminated in a leg amputation. He had to have the lower part of his right leg amputated in 1929. Finally, in 1931, suffering from the extreme ravages of diabetes that had necessitated the amputation of his foot, Eugène Ysaÿe died in his house in Forest, Belgium, 48 Avenue Brugman, and was interned in the Ixelles cemetery in Brussels. He therefore died shortly before his 73rd birthday. What legacy did Eugène Ysaÿe leave? An international violin competition in Brussels was created in his memory in 1937, where a young David Oistrakh triumphed. In 1951, this became the violin section of the Queen Elizabeth music competition. Eugène Ysaÿe was also close friends with Queen Elizabeth of Belgium, whom he taught violin. Despite her lack of talent, his widow took over the royal teaching herself after his death, and the Queen began the competition in his honour. Did Ysaÿe have Jewish heritage? Carl Flesch casts doubt on his racial membership, perhaps suggesting that he may have had Jewish ancestry due to his name Ysaÿe, which is kind of the Belgian version of Isaiah. His brother Jacob also became known as James later. Ysaÿe's son Antoine, who wrote a biography about his father with Bertram Radcliffe, tries to refute this ancestry, however. What do you think? Was Ysaÿe part Jewish? Let me know in the comments if you have any information on that. Another Ysaÿe biography has been written by Soviet author Lev Ginsberg. How have others commented on Eugène Ysaÿe? Pablo Casals claimed never to have heard a violinist play in tune before Ysaÿe. Carl Flesch called him the most outstanding and individual violinist I've ever heard in my life. Sir Henry Wood, founder of the Proms in the UK, spoke for a whole generation when he enthused that, having accompanied all the great violinists in the world during the past 50 years, of all of them, Ysaÿe impressed me most. He seemed to get more colour out of a violin than any of his contemporaries. I learned more in my early days from this great man than all other soloists put together. Music author and reviewer Julian Haylock wrote, Ysaÿe was also a composer of considerably greater talent than he himself was inclined to believe. Jacques Thibault felt that he was the great apostle of the truly musical. Fritz Kreisler said, it was Eugène Ysaÿe, not Joachim, who was my idol among violinists. Vieuxtemps is said to have heard the boy while walking past his parents' house and was thoroughly impressed, deciding to become his sponsor, obtaining a government subsidy for him to continue his studies. So he was obviously an ardent supporter of Ysaÿe. Alfred Megalin, the teacher of Henry Roth, paid lifelong homage to two deities, God and Ysaÿe, though not necessarily in that order. This is from Henry Roth's books. Violin Virtuosos from Paganini to the 21st Century, page 23, by Henry Roth. Heifetz is like the Empire State Building, Ysaÿe is like a mountain. Those were the words of Alfred Megalin, Roth's teacher. Albert Spalding said, his tone was not large, but it had an expressive quality difficult to describe. Conversely, Flesch describes Ysaÿe's tone as big and noble. So different views and opinions on his tone. George Bernard Shaw in 1881 refers to Ysaÿe's temperament as prodigiously unmanageable, yet holds the violinist in awe as a prodigy. This is when he reviewed a London Beethoven concerto performance by Ysaÿe, and apparently Rachmaninoff was a huge admirer. And we've already mentioned some French and Belgian composers who were huge supporters of Ysaÿe, dedicating works to him. Let's talk a little bit about the Elgar Concerto performance of 1912. Ysaÿe gave what has been described as a legendary 1912 performance of the Elgar Concerto in Berlin under Arthur Nikisch. And at this point he was at the peak of his fame. This is despite the fact that after 1910 Ysaÿe was past his best. Perhaps he transcended on this occasion though. Among his many younger admirers in the audience that night were Mischa Elman, Fritz Kreisler, who had himself premiered the concerto under Elgar's direction just 2 years previously in 1910, and Carl Flesch. So a star-studded audience. After the concert, Ysaÿe joined them for an impromptu soirée, during which all four violin legends played for each other simply for pleasure. Oh, to be a fly on the wall for that occasion. Recordings of Ysaÿe, well, he died in 1931, so there's not that many, but he did cut a series of discs between December 1912 and January 1913 that represent the bulk of his slender discography, and so it is possible to hear what he sounded like, albeit later in his life. Through the inevitable surface noise and relatively primitive recording technology of the early 20th century, one can still sense the presence of a player blessed with astonishing tonal command and musical insight. Now let's draw on some comments by the violin expert Henry Roth on Eugène Ysaÿe. As mentioned, Roth was Ysaÿe's violinistic grandson, so to speak. A violinist continuing on from Joachim and Sarasate, capable of expressing the aura of a romantic age that was now in fullest maturity. A remarkable Belgian violinist who symbolised the violinistic bridge between the 19th and 20th century. The linkage between the old world violin legends and breathing life into what was to come next in the 20th century with Heifetz and other huge talents. A gargantuan figure who represented both as man and musician, the very embodiment of the uninhibited, freewheeling romantic ethos, the ideal fusion of violinistic swashbuckler and poet, and musical storyteller of remarkable skill. Compositions of Ysaÿe. Among his own best compositions are 6 sonatas for unaccompanied violin, containing novel chordal and pizzicato effects. He also wrote 8 violin concerti, although none of them were performed during his lifetime apparently, chamber works, and the one and only opera in the Walloon dialect, Pierre Leeuwen in 1931, Peter the Miner. In conclusion, Ysaÿe's playing style ran the gamut of moods, from joy to tenderness, passion, bluster, bravura, poesy, fantasy, and expansive lyricism, to quote Roth once again. His was a strange, smouldering character, like a volcano about to explode. He could project a rare aura of melancholy and could move his audience profoundly. He was a musical maverick who moulded the works of composers to fit his own muse. So he was not one of those violin virtuosos who was obsessed with playing as the composer intended. Quite the contrary. Frank, when asked about how Ysaÿe's playing of his sonata did not conform to the composer's intentions, replied, "Don't worry, it is Ysaÿe who is right." So in a sense he sort of bettered the composition. He possessed a sizable repertoire of facial grimaces and could perform with tears streaming down his cheeks, though he warned his students against such indiscretions and eccentricities. Eugène Ysaÿe mesmerized audiences with his devil-may-care spontaneity, which extended to changing fingerings and bowings as the mood inspired him in mid-performance. Roth states that he was one of the most gifted, intuitive and original violinists who ever lived. Remarkably, not one of his 8 violin concertos saw publication over the course of his lifetime. That will be my next project, to hunt these down and see if I can find some recordings of them somewhere. Let's now consider the violins and bows of Ysaÿe, including the fascinating story of the Hercules, which was stolen from Ysaÿe during a concert, ultimately was passed on to Schering, who then finally donated it to the city of Jerusalem. Ysaÿe's favourite violin though was a Dager. Towards the end of his career, his sartory bows were adjusted with a thick rubber grip, which he called the banana, perhaps to reinforce the shaky condition of his right arm by that time. Violinist Eugène Ysaÿe, who we all really need to appreciate as violinists, larger than life and one of the greatest violinists who's ever lived, many would say.